Hi, I'm John Nunn, and this is another video in the series where I look at some books we published several years ago. In this case, I'm going to talk about Win with the London System by Vlatko Kovacevic and Sverre Johnsen. Now, Vlatko Kovacevic is a Grandmaster who's most famous for having once beaten Bobby Fischer, and Sverre Johnsen is a Norwegian openings expert who's written a number of successful opening books. The topic of the book is the London System, which is an opening for white based on d4 followed by a quick bishop f4. Now, the move order that's considered in this book is d4, d5, bishop f4, or d4, knight f6, bishop f4. In other words, playing bishop f4 on move 2. You can also play it with knight f3 first and then bishop f4. Very often there's a transposition, but as I say, it's the early bishop f4 idea that's being investigated in this book. The London System has often been very popular with club players for many decades because it can be learned and played without studying a huge amount of opening theory. But in recent years, it's become very popular at the highest level also. Many players have adopted it as a safety first opening, whereby you play a solid system with white, which nevertheless gives you some chances of an advantage, and avoid sharp lines in which your opponent might have some computer-based opening preparation to give you a nasty shock. Magnus Carlsen is one of the players who's adopted this kind of safety first approach to the openings, playing a wide range of openings which his opponents don't expect, and even if they're slightly dubious, then he seems to be able to turn them to advantage rather often. I'm not suggesting in any way that the London System is slightly dubious. It's a solid and safe opening for white, which gives chances for an edge, and particularly if your opponent is not very skilled in it, it's possible to get a significant advantage quite early on. Well, this book gives a lot of theory, and it also gives quite a large number of complete illustrative games. And rather than go through the theory, I'd just like to show you one of these games by strong Grandmaster Artur Yusupov. And this game demonstrates some of the key ideas of the London System as played against the King's Indian structure. So let's start off with the first few moves, d4, knight f6. Well, the actual game continued with knight f3, so it was the other move order, but as I say, it's a transposition, particularly if black plays g6. So the bishop comes out to f4. White's going to play e3, and white wishes to develop his bishop without first blocking it in. So the bishop comes to a relatively active position. These are all kind of normal developing moves. Black is playing a King's Indian structure based on d6 and the fianchetto, the bishop, on g7. There's a discussion in this book about the most accurate move order, which often depends on when white plays h3. White doesn't want his bishop on f4 to be exchanged off by knight h5 at some point, and early on knight h5 can often be met by bishop g5. But at some point white's going to have to play h3 so as to be able to drop the bishop back to h2 if black plays knight h5. And it's a matter of opinion as to when the best moment for that is. You can play h3 here, as indeed occurred in the game. Could even play earlier or possibly even later. And black continues with his plan, which is at some point to play e5. Again, a typical King's Indian move. It's slightly awkward for black to play this because at the moment white has 3 pieces, 1, 2, 3, covering e5. It's only defended twice. So black can't play it straight off. He has to play some preparatory move. And one of the things you can do is to play knight e4 here, which is kind of a bit of an odd looking move, but it enables white to play e5, or sorry, black to play e5 without any artificial preparatory moves. Of course, the knight is a bit of a target for attack here, and there are many pros and cons to this move. But in fact, in this game, black went to prepare e5 with this queen move, queen e8. It's more accurate to do this with the queen than with the rook. The rook often belongs on f8 later. Black may move the knight and advance the f-pawn. So queen e8 is a pretty standard move, and it's nothing wrong with it. Sometimes in the London System, white plays c3. And one of the reasons for the move order where white plays for early castling is that he also retains the option of playing c4, which is what Yusupov did here. Black got in his e5 move and the bishop dropped back. Now black would really like to play f5 at some point to bring his rook into the game and perhaps start some kind of initiative or attack on the king's side. So he moved his knight now to e4. There are quite a few interesting possibilities for white here. White doesn't have to exchange the knight immediately. He could, for example, gain space on the queen's side with a4, a5. White's main area of attack in this London system is on the queen's side. So it's good to gain space on the side where you're planning to attack. But in fact, Yusupov just played very simply, developed his knight, swapped off the black knight. Okay, now black made a critical decision. He decided to push the pawn to e4. And I actually think this is often wrong against the London system. In the King's Indian attack, which is this kind of position, but with the colours reversed and the bishop on c1 rather than h2, this is actually quite a good move. It's the start of an attack on the king's side. But the bishop on h2 in the London system is actually an excellent defender of the king's side. It's very hard for black to really break through there. And it's also very useful for supporting white's queenside attack, particularly if black pushes the pawn to e4, because this actually increases the scope of the bishop. So I actually think it's wrong for black to play e4 in positions like this. Instead, I think he should play something on the queen's side. Maybe he should just develop this bishop, which is blocked in with b6 and bishop b7. Or he could try to slow down white's play on the queen's side by playing a5. Anyhow, e4 is kind of tempting. It forces the knight back to the first rank. And you think, well, black may get some kind of an attack here, perhaps bringing his knight over with a bishop, perhaps sacrificing on h3 in the long run. But like I say, it's actually really hard to make that work with the bishop on h2. The extra defensive piece is really useful for white. White brought his knight back into a more active position, and black started to move pieces in the general direction of the white king. White's playing, as I say, on the queen's side. Okay, as it turns out, this move doesn't actually do very much, but of course if black is going to do something on the king's side, he's going to have to play something like h4, maybe knight h7, and then queen g5, or maybe knight g5. But it's all rather slow, and white's already going to be taking action on the queen's side. This knight is now ready to switch to b5, and the rook supporting the pawn to play c5 to undermine this c6, c7, d6 pawn chain. Bishop comes out to f5, a natural developing move. And now white is already playing c5. Now there are kind of threats already. Take on d6 and then knight b5, attacking the pawn on d6 and preparing rook c7. So black decided just to block things. But of course this move increases the scope of this bishop yet again. The knight now comes in, and black obviously can't play c6 because bishop d6 wins material. So black had to use his rook, which he really wanted to use on the king's side, to defend the pawn. But now white comes in again with a further threat to the pawn. Well, c6 is still unpleasant because the knight comes into d6, or maybe white can even win material with knight c7. So black dropped his knight back. But all these defensive moves mean that black isn't really doing anything on the king's side. He's been forced to tie his pieces down to defend the vulnerable pawn on c7. Well, according to the computer, white could even get away with knight takes a7 here. But it's understandable that white did not wish to put his knight into a kind of eternal pin. It's possible that white can get the knight out ultimately by playing b4, b5, b6, but it's the sort of thing you don't really like to risk in a game, because there's no easy way to unpin the knight, and the knight and queen are then completely tied down. So white played now c6, pretty much forcing the reply, b6, queen dropped back, and black now has a new weakness to defend, the pawn on d5. The white pawn on c6 prevents black from defending it with c6 himself, and white's got queen b3, knight c3, targeting this pawn. So black is already having to play some more defensive moves to avoid the loss of a pawn. But now is an interesting moment because white's kind of done all he can on the queen side. And he's done quite well. He's got this nasty pawn wedge on c6 and he's fixed this vulnerable pawn on c7. But it's not completely obvious how he's going to make further progress. Of course, he could play a4, a5, but then black plays b5 and okay, white could move his knight and put his rook on c5, but still it's not completely clear that's going to do anything. So now Yusupov showed why he's a strong grandmaster. He now played the move bishop f4. And what he wants to do now is that he wants to play f3. And of course he wants to do it without losing his pawn on e3 with check after he takes f3 and so on. And it's this opening of a second front on the side of the board where actually black would normally be attacking. That's a nice feature of this game. Because as it happens, black has played so many defensive moves, he's not actually in any kind of position to attack on the king side anymore. And if white plays f3 and rook e1, it's white who's going to have the initiative on the king side, and the rook on f1 is going to come into the game straight away. Well, black played bishop f6, he wants to kick the bishop away with g5. And, well, okay, there were other possibilities. Bishop h2 is actually a pretty strong move. He could also have put the bishop on e5 like this. That's recommended in the book. It's not clear to me it's really stronger than bishop h2, but both moves are clearly rather good. And now black can actually win this pawn, but as you can see, he's had to play a further weakening move on the king side. And although now he wins this pawn on e3, he in fact decided now to play g4. Queen takes e3 check also leads to similar problems. His bishops are vulnerable to attack on the f-file. His pawn on h5 is hanging, and his king has been deserted by the normal defensive pawns. Well, he actually played g4, kind of forcing white to take the pawn on d5. Another point of playing f3 was, of course, to activate this bishop to target the weak d5 pawn. And now he took these pawns. Well, black has actually won a pawn here. But now white seizes the initiative. Black, it's a kind of paradox actually. Black has won a pawn. White has no pawns in front of his king at all. They've all gone. Black still has a couple of pawns, and yet it's white who's winning. And the reason is just piece activity. All the white pieces are really active, and most of them are in an excellent position to either defend the white king or take part in an attack, like the queen and the two rooks, and the knight on c3 can jump in. And black's pieces are kind of stuck. These rooks are not doing anything for the defence. The bishop is actually attacked right now. So black is really in serious trouble here. Well, the queen went back to g5 to defend the bishop, and now the knight came in. Well, this is in fact a winning position. There are some nice lines. For example, if black takes now, white just takes back with the bishop. And I'll just show you one interesting line. There's a threat now to pin the queen. And after knight here, white can play rook g1. Queen has to stay defending this bishop. Goes to h4. Now white plays bishop g6, attacking the pawn on f7. Black defends it. And now there's a nice move, rook e4. And after, well, the black queen is in fact already trapped in this position. So that's a definite win for white. So even taking on e4 wouldn't have helped. Black actually went back to g6. And now white wins material by force. First of all, swaps on f6. Then the queen switches over to skewer the bishop and knight. Well, black finds the best defence. White can't take on f6 because there's a mate on g2. But it's still a loss of material. 4 series of exchanges. Now there's actually quite a nice finish, because black has rook and 2 pawns for 2 bishops, which you might think, well, that's not so bad. But white's attack actually continues into the endgame. So first of all, he gives a rook check. King can't go to h8 because of bishop e5 and mate next move. So he has to go to f8. And now white at last uses his London system bishop and takes that weak pawn on c7. So that if rook takes bishop, then bishop comes to e6. And if king e8, then rook g8 mate. So rook e7, and now rook here, and then c7. And next move, white swaps twice on e7 and promotes his c-pawn. So black can't actually take the bishop. He played this defensive move, rook e8, and white greedily took another pawn. It's actually the same thing, that if black now takes the bishop, if black now takes the bishop, it's bishop c5 check, rook back, and rook e1, and black can't unpin immediately, he has to move his s-pawn first, white plays c7 and then swaps twice on e7. So it's a kind of nice finish with the same basic motif repeated on a different square on the diagonal. So black moved his rook here to stop the bishop coming to c5. Now this bishop is actually attacked by the rook, so the bishop dropped back. Black played rook e6, and there was a nice finish which ended the game. Pawn comes to b4, and now bishop c5 check is a threat, king e8, rook g8 mate, or bishop c5 check and then possibly c7. There's actually no defence here for black, so he resigned. So it was really a model London system game, using the London system bishop to enhance the queenside attack and forcing black on the defensive, and then the nice touch, opening the switching sides, seizing initiative on the king side as well, and overstretching the black forces. A lot of the games in this book are quite attractive. There's a large number of complete games which are very, very useful, and each game ends with a section of lessons to be learned, which is a good summary of what was covered in that particular game. So a good book on the London system is one book that was published some years ago, but the theory in this opening doesn't change very much, and its explanation of the general ideas is excellent. Well, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you'll join me for the next one.